We've talked about this before. I talk about it with a lot of friends in the business, but people our age and even older and younger, that the impact of Star Wars just cannot be underestimated, undersold. I'm not even sure what the word is anymore.
Yeah.
Just it's so profound, and it feels to me so much like we were just at the right age, the right time. Because I have exactly the same influences as you. I was also curious about comic books specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Were you a comic book reader when you were a kid?
Yeah, I got a pile of comics that I read 5,000 times from an uncle. And that ranged everything from like Superman to some Spideys to Witching Hour. I was actually pretty influenced by horror books. He had a bunch of horror books. He had war books that I didn't read. Horror comics I really dug. I read those Phantom Stranger and Spectres and that sort of stuff a lot. So I mean that accounts for some of the darker stuff that I like to do. But I didn't buy comics until about junior high. And then we started going to our local store, and I do remember very distinctly. It was New Mutants, it was the Demon Bear saga, it was Danny Moonstar cover, Bill Sienkiewicz, and you're like, what the hell is it?
Right.
Like, it looked nothing like any comic I owned by a long shot. And then you open it up and you see this beautiful painting, then you open it up and, again, expressionistic art where, somebody's eyeball can be over here because they're mad and that sort of thing. It just blew my mind. So then I dove right back in, and I was a sort of diehard Marvel fan for a long time. And it was two opposite ends of the spectrum for me as far as art Adams, Bill Sienkiewicz.
Of course.
And just in their own way, that level of hyper detail, but one sort of superstructure and one, so chaotic. But that was the stuff I really got into. And I'm ashamed to admit, as a writer, I did not pay attention to writers' names as much as I should have. But of course, Claremont was a huge influence because I was reading all those X books and New Mutants and all that stuff. So.
And you got him, I think, probably at, a perfect time.
Yeah, I would say, for sure.
So you had said we. Did you mean your family? Did you have friends? Was reading comics for you a solitary experience, or did you have a group of friends?
I had some friends who had gotten me got me back into comics. But I found the day I found that New Mutants, believe it or not, was at a like a cigarette store. It was like at this place called Te Amo out in Long Island. But it's I was sick. I was home from school, and it was on a spinner rack in a convenience store. So it's like you don't see that anymore. But that was how I got back into it. But then I had friends who were older, and these were the guys who, they were all smart guys, and they played Dungeons and Dragons and all that kind of stuff. And they were the guys who handed me Watchmen. So I was like, oh, well, that's pretty messed up. That was a few years later, but that was the crew that I kind of exchanged comics with and stuff. And other than that, though, it was pretty solitary. I went to the store with the guys. I had a couple of friends who were into it, and they were actually into more or less mainstream comics than I were. They had older brothers, so they were getting Cerberus and that sort of stuff. And had, I think, a broader range of titles they were reading. I was pretty straightforward superheroes for the most part.
This might be a trick to answer, but I've discovered, and you might have too, teaching that there's still a pretty severe dividing line in fandom between mainstream superheroes, say, and independent stuff. I tend to find even with my students, 19, 20, they prefer one or the other. Like those camps seem to be pretty solid and fairly divided. Do you have a sense of why you liked superheroes? What was appealing to you about Marvel superheroes as opposed to independent books or characters like Cerberus?
Some of the independent stuff I felt I couldn't just jump right into. I felt like I had to know too much to get involved, and that was why Watchmen was sort of when it came into my hands, which it had already been out for a while. But finding that in a big self-contained, volume was sort of, okay, this is the whole story, I can read it. Whereas, Cerberus had been already X amount of volumes,
right.
And the Marvel stuff, I felt like I could dive in at any point. There was also a lot of new stuff. I mean, it was like Web of Spider-Man and all this kind of stuff, Secret Wars, like these things that were real quick to, get in, get out kind of things I could latch onto. But I really, with the X-Men especially, I really related to, and the New Mutants especially, I really related to those character dynamics. I love those characters, I really did. And so I just, once you're in, it's the soap opera effect. I mean, that
Of
we
course.
talked about, it's, you get hooked by the art, you stay for the story, that kind of thing. And I wanted to know what happened to those characters. So it wasn't until a little bit later when I started expanding, and again, my friends' brothers got older, that then it was, oh, you should check out Dark Knight, and you should check out, then it was other stuff. And Dark Knight is very influential to me, even though somebody who's in this room worked on it, I'm embarrassed to say. But yes, it was.
Hi, Klaus.
Hi, Klaus.
Yes.
But that period of time too, that was when, for me in comics, it was, wait, there's a whole lot of other stuff that I don't know anything about. And then it was a little bit more digging into indie books or trying the darker titles or stuff that was off the beaten path. And then I went away from it because I couldn't afford it.
Oh.
Comics then became like, once they hit
When was that?
The jump to $1.25, I think.
I'm just trying to, because for me, it was going to college. I suddenly could no longer afford comics. It was amazing.
Exactly right. It jumped to $1.25, and I was like, well, I used to be able to get, 10 comics. Now I can only get 5, like this stinks. And but in college, and I had a buddy who still had a lot of graphic novels, and I would just borrow from him. And that was how I got into actually all DC stuff, because he had all those trades. So then
interesting.
I went through all his stuff, and then when I could finally, then it was at NYU, then it was like, oh, I'm right around the corner from St. Mark's, so I'll go to St. Mark's Comics, and that was when I picked up Preacher, and that changed my whole perspective also.
How old are you?
I am 41.
No, how old are you then?
All right, you can cut out
Yeah,
that.
never mind
41.
that.
Forget that. I was in college, so I was, I was going to grad school, so I was 23, I guess.